I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as fighting rages around Pokrovsk and Ukrainian strikes continue inside Russia on energy facilities, we report on an uptick in the tempo of US surveillance flights across the Black Sea, just as Washington's ambassador to NATO arrives for talks in Kyiv. We discuss Ukraine's claim to have struck an elite Russian special forces unit stationed on an oil drilling platform in the Black Sea, and we talk to business writer Stephanie Baker, who says Donald Trump's sanctioning of Russian oil giants Lukoil and Rosneft is far more significant than we realise.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 4th of November, 3 years and 255 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's executive editor for audio, Francis Dearnley, and senior writer for Bloomberg and sanctions expert dialing in from Washington, D.C., Stephanie Baker. I started with the latest military updates from Ukraine. Let's go straight into the Donbass. There's intense fighting still in the vicinity of Pokrovsk. Russia is advancing inside the city, mainly on the western side, we think, but also in the nearby region. The Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, citing comments by a Ukrainian officer yesterday, says Russian forces continue efforts to infiltrate further into Pokrovsk and are attempting to establish observation posts and concentrate personnel within the town. I would have thought they are undoubtedly bringing forward drone operators too. Now, Russia's MOD published footage yesterday purporting to show Russian forces interacting with and evacuating civilians from Pokrovsk. And Russian mill bloggers have been reporting for the last couple of days that Russian soldiers are checking the documents of civilians in the town. We can't verify any of that. Now, Ukraine continues to defend and counterattack where possible. They seem to have taken back some territory in Rodinska. That's about 10 kilometres directly north of Pokrovsk. Ukraine's 7th Rapid Reaction Corps says the Pokrovsk-Minarad highway that runs due east out of Pokrovsk, about 5 km to Minarad, they say that highway is still open to Ukrainian forces, although it would be almost certainly under surveillance and fire control by Russia, as in they could bring down accurate direct fire onto that highway. Now, linked to this, a Ukrainian soldier going by the name of Artem Karyakin says that the situation around Pokrovsk is a direct result of Russia developing its Rubicon group of drone specialists. We've spoken about this group before. He says the same Russian drone crews that destroyed Ukrainian logistics in Russian effort to push Ukraine out of Kursk last winter and this spring are operating, adding that if it hadn't been for the Kursk operation, he says the events we are witnessing today would have likely happened in the Pokrovsk-Minarad area back in the spring. Now, you'll remember last year Russia reformed its structures and created a new organisation to consolidate the best and most qualified drone specialists into a single unmanned operations centre, a little bit like what Ukraine did with the unmanned systems forces. Now, they call this the Rubicon Group. They've redeployed a number of drone specialists from various fronts, pushed it into the area of Suja in the Kursk Oblast to help push out the Ukrainian forces that were camped there for quite a number of months. It's thought that the Rubicon Group is now back down in the Donbass around Pokrovsk and elsewhere. I don't know. I mean, that seems like a reasonable, a plausible theory. It's worth examining. I'd be interested in your thoughts. If the analysis is correct, though, I think it's interesting that Russia has not expanded the Rubicon Group to be able to repeat these tactics more broadly across the front. Anyway, just my view, be interested in yours. Connected to this, Ukraine's military intelligence department, the HUR, released footage yesterday, but with no date on it, purporting to show a strike on a command post of the Rubicon Center, a command post run by Russian drone operators. This strike was supposedly hit by FP2, so the Firepoint, also make the FP5, the Flamingo, but Firepoint, the company, FP2 kamikaze drones in temporarily occupied Avdiivka, that's just north of Donetsk city. Now, across the rest of Ukraine, Yesterday, Russia fired a ballistic missile, 6 S-300 anti-aircraft missiles and 130 drones at Ukraine overnight. 92 drones were brought down, but it's thought the remaining ones and all missiles got through, hitting 14 locations. One location that was not hit was Kyiv, possibly as the US's NATO ambassador, Matthew Whitaker, was either in the city already or on the way. There's been footage this morning. Certainly he's there now. He met with President Zelensky this morning. More of that from Francis shortly. So last night and over the last 24 hours, Dnipropetrovsk was badly hit, also Kherson and Odessa regions. Russian forces conducted a maritime drone attack on the port of Izmail, down in the southwest of Ukraine. Ombre Intelligence, the global maritime risk management firm, says that NASA's FIRMS system, FIRMS being the Fire Information for Resource Management System, basically a satellite that can see big fires from space. NASA data shows fires ongoing in both port boundaries at Izmail and in the forests on the opposite side of the Danube River. That is in Romania. They say 12 Garan 2 drones, so Garan 2 being the Russian-made version of the Iranian Shaheds. 12 Garan 2 drones were used in that attack. They say no damage to merchant vessels or casualties had been reported. No response yet from NATO or Romania that I've seen about these strikes inside NATO territory again. Elsewhere across the country, Kramatorsk station, Ukraine's iconic frontline rail stop, is going to be closed for an indefinite period. Ukrainian Railways, Ukrzaliznytsia, told the Kyiv Independent this morning. They say it's going to be closed due to safety concerns amidst Russia's intensifying strikes on railway infrastructure across the country. Now, trains that ran from Kyiv and Lviv to Kramatorsk in Donetsk Oblast, about 20 k's west of the front line, those trains are now going to have their final destination in the city of Huzarivka. That's in Kharkiv Oblast, about 30 kilometres to the northwest. You'll remember Kramatorsk train station, kind of iconic. It was the last stop before the front lines in the east. It became well known as a place where people said goodbye to their loved ones, soldiers heading to the front, as well as those coming back and returning the other way. Now, according to Ukrainian Railways, the Donetsk Regional Military Administration says it's going to provide buses to further transfer passengers from Huzarivka into the frontline cities such as Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. In a statement, they said, "We continue to operate wherever possible from a safety perspective and appreciate your understanding." Last month, Deputy Prime Minister for Reconstruction, Alexei Kuleba, said Russian forces had carried out nearly 300 attacks on Ukrainian railway infrastructure since the beginning of August this year. OK, into Russia, and Ukrainian strikes across the country continued last night. The Russian Defense Ministry said it shot down 85 drones across Voronezh, Nizhny Novgorod, Belgorod, Kursk, Lipetsk, Volgograd and Sverdlovsk oblasts, as well as the Republic of Bashkortostan. Now, that is pretty much everywhere, from the borders of Ukraine to the east of Moscow and even 1,000 kilometres southeast of the city, near the border with Kazakhstan. That's the Republic of Bashkortostan. Clearly things got through, despite what Russian MOD said. However, they say they shot down. Something obviously got through in a number of locations, as explosions were reported at a petrochemical plant in the city of Stelitymak in the Republic of Bashkortostan. 2 oil refineries in Kustovo and Nizhny Novgorod Oblast, that's the one to the east of Moscow. They also, reportedly, for some reason, magically caught on fire. And in Russia's Volgograd Oblast, an electrical substation was damaged due to, you're right, falling drone debris. Apparently, this comes from Governor Andrei Bosharov. So thank God the drones didn't hit, that's all I can say. Now, an electrical substation in the city of Rilsk in Kursk Oblast was also hit. Footage of much of all of that is online, including footage of that strike on the petrochemical plant in Stelitymak, with a voice you can hear saying, "Damn, everything is smoking." Also, you'll find footage of the 2 oil refineries in Kustovo, just east of Moscow, with a woman saying, "The whole sky is red." All right, let's go down to the Black Sea. Ukrainian forces claim to have struck an elite Russian special forces unit stationed on an oil drilling platform in the Black Sea. These strikes are said to have killed an anti-tank missile crew and destroyed reconnaissance equipment at the Sivash drilling rig near Crimea. Ukraine's Navy put this out on Monday. I mean, I have a few questions. How do you know it's an anti-tank missile crew? How do you know you killed them, etc., etc.? But Russia has disputed Ukraine's account, distributing footage of their own, purporting to show a Ukrainian Navy boat destroyed by what they say was a Lancet drone. We can't confirm that either. Ukrainian military officials say the video that they put out shows its forces successfully deploying a suicide drone against the Russian positions there. Now, this Sivash platform is one of 4 offshore installations known as the Boyko Towers. They're about 100 k's south of Odessa in the Black Sea, between Crimea and the kind of far southwest coast of Ukraine. They were seized by Russia following the 2014 annexation of Crimea. And after taking the platforms, Russia equipped each with intelligence and electronic warfare equipment, along with hydroacoustic systems, we are told. These have enabled Moscow to monitor surface, air and subsurface activity in the northwestern Black Sea area between Crimea and Odessa. So the footage that I've seen, that we're running on our website at the moment, it shows something exploding in the sea, which could be that maritime drone that Moscow's talking about. But clearly something else, quite a lot of other things, also got through. Something definitely hit the rig. Something hit the rig at water level and also from the air. Not clear from what I've seen that anyone was killed. Now, sticking in the Black Sea, and I'll point you to the website Itamil Radar. This is a flight tracking website that says there was intense US surveillance activity over the Black Sea yesterday afternoon. Hat tip here, thank you to Jay for pointing me in this direction. But Italmil Radar is a website that uses open source data from the likes of Flight Radar 24, 360 Radar and a few others. They say 2 American reconnaissance aircraft were active over the Black Sea yesterday, Monday afternoon. They say a US Navy P-8A Poseidon operated mainly off the Romanian coast and southwest of Crimea, while a smaller aircraft, a US Army Bombardier CL-600 Artemis, a modified business jet, basically, much smaller than the Poseidon, they say that was carrying out long-range surveillance over the Black Sea in a kind of west to east loop, about 50 k's off the coast of Turkey. Italmil Radar says that this is the first time they've tracked the Artemis aircraft performing that kind of mission over the Black Sea. They say it usually operates over the Baltic region or conducts surveillance flights over land. They say that makes yesterday afternoon's activity a bit unusual. Now, added to that, this morning, an American rivet joint, RC-135 uniform, 1P5U rivet joint, flown out of the US base here in Britain, RF Mildenhall in Suffolk, that was also active over the Black Sea near Crimea. All these aircraft are equipped for intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance missions, so they are regularly used to monitor Russian military movements in Crimea and southern Russia. So that activity is not new, but I think the intensity might be. Interesting that happens as Matthew Whitaker was in town. Okay, one more for me. I'll point you to a report in today's Kyiv Independent that says an investigation has been launched into possible negligence after a Russian missile strike on Saturday on a Ukrainian military base in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast killed and wounded a number of troops who had reportedly gathered for an awards ceremony. In a statement yesterday on their website, the State Bureau of Investigation said it had sent a team to the site of the attack to look at whether safety protocols were followed during an air raid alert and whether proper shelters had been arranged. Now, I first heard of this strike yesterday from a post on social media by Ukrainian journalist Dmitry Svetnenko, who said that his brother, Volodymyr Svetnenko, 43 years old, a man serving with the 35th Separate Marine Brigade, had been killed in that attack whilst the award ceremony was going on. Mr. Svetnenko said he and his comrades were gathered on the parade ground to be awarded. They gathered the best pilots and infantrymen of the brigade in order to command. They were in open terrain. Ballistics flew in. The story of negligence repeated itself. Now, the 30th Marine Corps, which includes the 35th Marine Brigade, confirmed that its service members had been targeted in this Russian attack in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. They said at the time of the strike, servicemen from one of the separate Marine brigades were in the village. The strike was delivered on the centre of the settlement where there are no military facilities. They said that a number of people had been suspended from their posts following that strike. Now, that's us up to date, Francis, but what have you seen on the military and diplomatic front?
Well, thanks, Dom, and great to have you with us again, Stephanie. As luck would have it, the lead political story today is economic, with the Council of the EU just approving the 5th tranche of the Ukraine facility funding in the amount of 1.8 billion euros. That's about $2.1 billion, including some of the money withheld during the previous payment. This amount reflects Ukraine's successful completion of 9 steps required for the 5th disbursement, as well as one outstanding step from the 4th disbursement, the official statement read. Now, if you're wondering what on earth I'm going on about, just as a reminder, the Ukraine facility allocates 50 billion euros in loans and grants to support Ukraine's post-war recovery and modernisation between 2024 and 2027. The disbursement of 32 billion euros is tied to the reforms Kyiv has pledged to carry out. The fourth tranche, disbursed in August, was reduced from 4.5 billion euros to 3.2 billion euros after Kyiv failed to complete 3 of the required reforms. One of them was a reform of ARMA, the State Asset Management Agency, which was subsequently done and so was included in this fifth payment. As European Pravda writes, Ukraine was originally set to receive 2 billion euros in this fifth tranche, but the EU withheld some of the money until Ukraine adopts 2 additional judicial reforms. If the reforms are not implemented by mid-2026, the funds may be lost. Now, the timing of this is especially important given how external funding is increasingly crucial for Kyiv, as it faces mounting war costs and a substantial budget shortfall. That's why there are efforts to bolster the country's financial stability via other methods as well, such as the European Commission €140 billion reparations loan covered by the frozen Russian assets. But as our Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes talked about on the podcast last week, the next crucial meeting relating to that isn't until mid-December. But staying on the economic theme, Chinese oil refineries are scaling back their imports of Russian crude following the US's imposition of sanctions on energy giants Lukoil and Rosneft. That's coming from Bloomberg. Analysts estimate that the move could reduce Russia's oil exports to China by nearly half, approximately 45%, or around 400,000 barrels per day. I know Stephanie's going to talk much more about the impact of Lukoil and Rosneft sanctions later on, but it is worth mentioning that there are some predicting a global oil glut, with the Saudis upping production to win back more market share, thus meaning global production increasing while global demand slows. That would be, suffice to say, very serious for Moscow. Further, top Western oil companies are enjoying a windfall from the expanding attacks on Russia's oil industry, both literal and economic, that have boosted global refining profit margins and mitigated concerns over that looming supply glut. The beneficiary of that, in lead terms, is the United States. And I would wager that that is something that may speak to why Donald Trump was willing to see those strikes from Kyiv. But it remains to be seen how much further he's willing to go on that score. Not all sanctions are proving as effective as hoped, more evidence of which can be found in South Korea's exports to tiny Kyrgyzstan, which reached $500 million in 1 month. Now, since Kyrgyzstan is not under sanctions, it's evidently buying the goods and then re-exporting them to Russia. Now, that's troubling, given that Seoul is such a high-tech economy. No doubt some of those bits that are going through are relating to pieces of equipment, pieces of software for drones. But moving away from economics for a moment, President Zelensky held a meeting with senior figures yesterday, including the first time NATO's chief US official was present in Kyiv, posting the following afterwards. I had a meeting with representatives of the US, the UK, Germany, France, Italy, Poland, Canada, and the Netherlands to NATO, and praised their country's contributions to our defence. We are grateful to Germany for the Patriot systems, to the US for the opportunity to purchase weapons and air defence systems through the Pearl Initiative, to the UK and France for the missiles, to Canada and to the Netherlands for their contributions to the Pearl Initiative, and to all other countries for their assistance. This support truly saves lives of our people, and it is very important that new countries join the initiative. We discussed opportunities to strengthen the protection of our energy system ahead of winter, the purchase of air defence systems and missiles for them, as well as the reinforcement of our tactical aviation. We also discussed the importance of maintaining sanctions against Russia. Now, President of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, also had a call with Zelensky yesterday, writing afterwards, Ukraine will not face this winter alone. The EU stands with you, providing emergency energy support to help Ukraine through the coming months. They also discussed the fifth tranche of the aforementioned Ukraine facility, though there was no mention of the supposed 12-point European peace plan that I referenced last week. Zelensky claims he hasn't seen it either, noting that there are several proposals on the table, but what's important in this matter is whether I, as the President of Ukraine, have seen this plan. No. There are currently consultations among advisors. There are several different conversations. There is no clear plan on the table yet. Now, that may or may not be true, but in any case, it does seem the various plans circulating at present are not fully endorsed across all countries in the coalition of the willing. Yet we may soon find ourselves debating the merits of a plan without the prerequisite political resolve within Europe to implement it and reclaim the strategic initiative. Now, I know I sound like a broken record on this, but the point remains fundamental to me, and I know many of you. It's all well and good saying that what you think a just peace should look like after a ceasefire, but we're forgetting the first step, defining what you want the outcome of the war to be, and then seeking to force events to stop it. But anyway, rant over. Those are the lead stories in the political realm today, Dom, but looking forward to getting more into the granular of the economic situation with Stephanie now.
Well, thanks, Francis. Always good to hear a Dearnley rant. Now, delighted to welcome back to the pod Stephanie Baker, writer, thinker, economist, journalist. Take us through the latest updates on the economic angle to this war, specifically on the oil situation. Now, you're saying that we have missed, not just we here at the Telegraph, but I do include us in that, but we, the world, have missed the importance of the recent sanctioning by the US of the Russian joints Lukoil and Rosneft. Now, those two oil companies combined transfer around half of Russia's total oil exports. So what have we missed? What do we need to know? And welcome back to the pod, Stephanie.
Well, thanks for having me back. Greetings from a sunny Washington, D.C., where I've been for the past few days. Yeah, I really do think this surprised me that the Trump administration went ahead with this move to sanction Russia's two largest oil producers. It's something I had been saying was the obvious next step to put pressure on Putin to come to the negotiating table. I thought that they were going to opt for the secondary tariff option, which had been pushed by some Republicans in the Senate. In other words, putting high tariffs on buyers of Russian oil like China and India. And instead, they went with the traditional route of imposing direct sanctions on two of Russia's biggest oil producers, which is something that the Biden administration was too reluctant and scared to do. I think part of the reason why it's easier for the Trump administration to do this now is because of the glut of oil on global markets. There's a lot more room and capacity in oil markets to do this without causing self-harm. In other words, causing harm to the U.S. economy, European global economies by taking a lot of oil off the market. Yeah, you have OPEC countries that are pumping more oil. There's an expectation that there's going to be a real glut, particularly in the first quarter. So there's a lot more room to do this. And you already see an immediate reaction from Russia's biggest buyers. You've got 4 major Chinese oil companies saying they're suspending purchases of Russian oil. Likewise, 4 major Indian refineries doing the same. Turkey, which is also a buyer of Russian oil, is also indicating that it is reducing purchases. And that's already having an immediate effect. You know, we've seen that Russian seaborne crude shipments fell sharply in the past 4 weeks. And that is, I think, in a direct response to the U.S. sanctions. Now, the key question here is, how long does this last? Is this just an initial fear that the Trump administration could turn around and impose secondary sanctions? In other words, target those refineries and banks that are facilitating purchases from sanctioned Russian oil companies. Is this just a wait and see to figure out how tough the Trump administration is going to be on enforcement? I mean, one of the strengths here is that Trump is notoriously unpredictable. We don't know what he's going to do. And I think there's a certain fear in the market that if they do get caught buying oil from Rosneft and Lukoil, that those refineries in India and China could get cut off from the US dollar, which would be pretty devastating for their business. So a lot of this really depends on enforcement from the Trump administration or the threat of enforcement. I mean, the threat is really key here because You don't necessarily need to be fining a refinery for buying sanctioned Russian oil. You just have to say you're going to do so. And there's enough oil on the market for a lot of these Chinese and Indian refineries to go elsewhere for their oil. It's safer. Now, I do think that this could be temporary until Russia finds workarounds. There's certainly the possibility that they'll find new shadow fleet tankers to transport this oil. They'll be increasing the amount of ship-to-ship transfers to hide the origin of the oil. A colleague of mine just interviewed the Gunvor CEO, the major oil trading firm, which has just agreed to buy Lukoil's international assets. And, he said, look, Russian oil always finds a way to flow, and he expects that they will indeed find routes to do so. So this could be temporary, but there's absolutely no doubt this is going to hit Russian oil revenues hard, and that buyers will be demanding deeper discounts. And this is making it more difficult for Russia at a time when its budget deficit is incredibly high and growing.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned Gunvor there, which I think, as you say, was Lukoil. Most of the assets have been sold to. But isn't Gunvor also very, very closely linked to Vladimir Putin himself?
Well, there's a history there. Yes, you're absolutely right about that. Gunvor was co-founded by a Russian oligarch named Gennady Timchenko, who is very close to Putin and had been accused of basically holding Putin's money for him through Gunvor. Now, the Russians have denied that. Timchenko has denied that, but it was very curious when in 2014, after Russia's annexation of Crimea, Timchenko was targeted by U.S. sanctions, but he managed to sell his stake in Gunvor right on the eve of those sanctions, right before those sanctions hit. Gunvor escaped those U.S. penalties, which would have been devastating for the company, and he sold his stake to Gunvor's now chief executive officer, Torbjörn Tornqvist. So, yeah, there is a history there for sure.
Now, one thing one of the many things I don't understand, that we've got a good article today by our colleague Melissa Lawford in the paper. I don't think it's yet online, but it's worth grabbing. If you still remember what a paper feels like to actually hold and read, folks, I do suggest going and having a look at Melissa's article in the business section. She says that data show US sanctions have a far higher impact than European ones. She's talking about data analysis from the company Kepler that says a shadow fleet vessel hit by US sanctions sees its use drop 74% in the 5-month period after being sanctioned, compared to 31% for UK and EU. What's going on there then, Stephanie?
Well, the oil market uses principally dollars. So any sanctions that affect companies would really cut them out of that U.S. dollar market. And so that would have a hugely devastating effect on any company operating in the oil market. I think only 5% of Russian oil is traded using dollars. They've really pivoted, trying to conduct trades in rubles and Chinese yuan. But nonetheless, no refinery wants to be cut off from the U.S. dollar system. They're not going to risk that. That's why U.S. sanctions are so much more powerful. Just the reach of dollars in terms of global trade, exchange markets is enormous. And so I think that's why the dollar is much more powerful. And traditionally, enforcement from the U.S. has been much tougher than it has been from the EU. You've had some really tough Justice Department actions for sanctions violations. There have been U.S. Treasury Department fines. Those have been much smaller, of course. But the U.S. has traditionally been monitoring violations much more aggressively than the EU has. And that's why U.S. sanctions have so much more of an impact. Now, you mentioned something that I think is really important. One of the things that the Trump administration did not do was to add any of these shadow fleet tankers to the U.S. sanction list. And what you have right now is, because the Trump administration had done no action on Russia sanctions since Trump entered the White House in January, the U.S. has fallen way behind the EU and the UK in the number of these Russian shadow fleet tankers that they have blacklisted. Right now, I think the U.S. has sanctioned about 200 of them, and I think the EU and the UK have sanctioned about 500. So the three major sanction partners are not on the same page, and that is the next step that the Trump administration could take, would be to add a lot more of these tankers to the U.S. sanction list. And that would have a huge impact if they did that. Now, that is much more labor intensive for the U.S. Treasury to do than just putting sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, which is, a playbook that has been in place for months, if not years. So that was a fairly easy step for them to take. Researching all these tankers, getting the legal basis and the documentation needed to put them on the U.S. sanctions list, that's a lot more work, but that is definitely the next step that they could take to really kind of push down Russia's oil revenues.
Stats I've recently seen says in millions of barrels of oil per day of Russian oil imported. June saw 1.7 million barrels of oil imported into India. July and August, 1.5. October, lower still, 1.2. Now, are those reductions significant? Is that just the Trump effect, just front of house window dressing, or does it actually mean anything?
No, I think it does. It's very hard to model how this works because there's so many different factors in the dynamic on pricing, right? I mean, there's no question that India's reductions of imports from Russia will have an impact on Putin's ability to continue to finance the war. It's going to reduce Russia's oil revenues. We're already seeing it. But the question is, how long does that last, and do they find workarounds? Because as soon as you introduce a sanction, there are immediate steps that are taken to try to find ways to obfuscate the source of that oil and to keep it flowing, create new middlemen, find new tankers, find new routes, so find new payment methods even. It is having an effect. We won't know the full effect until the sanctions really come into force on November 21st. The Trump administration has given traders until then to settle existing trades and contracts. So I think we're going to see the full effect towards the end of this month. But remember, India traditionally was not a big buyer of Russian oil. Before the full-scale invasion in 2022, I think it only bought about 1% of its oil from Russia. It stepped in to opportunistically buy up discounted Russian oil. In many respects, it's reverting back to, or it could continue to revert back to its pre-2022 buying patterns. This is definitely going to be driving down Russia's oil revenues. It's a pretty complex calculation, though, because Russia changed the way it taxed oil revenues to focus more on volume extracted rather than export prices. It would have had a bigger impact had Russia not changed its tax regime, but it's certainly going to take the hit on Russian budget revenues at a time when its deficit is the highest it's been since COVID.
Thank you. Now, last one from me, but delighted. And I forgot to say at the start, thank you for joining us so early in Washington, getting up so early to listen to us too. Last one from me, if we could sort of zoom out, Stephanie. So where are we now? Here we are, end of 2025. Numerous sanctions packages across all the different flavors, shadow fleet, etc., money, blah, blah, blah. I mean, where is the direction of travel here? Are we up to the pace that commentators and we were hoping that the international response to Russia's aggression would be, I don't know, a year ago, 2 years ago? Take the pulse of where we are at the moment on the kind of economic war, economic response to Russia's aggression.
Yes. I mean, the sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil were the big final step that I was hoping, not final, but, the big major step that I thought would have a meaningful impact on Russia's ability to finance the war. But the issue here is you can't just put a sanction on and leave it and, go make yourself a cup of tea. This is a process that needs constant monitoring, enforcement. There needs to be someone watching and putting new companies, new tankers, new payment methods, et cetera, traders on those sanctions lists to make sure that they are properly enforced. And that takes work. And I'm not seeing evidence of that from the Trump administration so far. This is a great initial first step, but it will be meaningless without enforcement. So, look, the economic war was never going to single-handedly drive Russian forces out of Ukraine or change Putin's calculus. Putin seems perfectly willing to bankrupt Russia's economic future for the sake of this war. But what the sanctions are really designed to do is to make it harder for him to sustain, to make it more costly, to create that friction, throw sand in the gears, and increase pressure on him to come to the negotiating table. We're not quite there yet. I think Russia's economy is slowing. Its growth in the first 9 months was 1%. That's far lower than it was in the first few years of the war after Putin threw record amount of money into defense and security, which really juiced the economy. So there are real warning signs coming from the Russian economy, and that could have an impact on his ability to keep this going. But that is the real aim here, is to slow him down, to create problems for the Russian defense industry to keep its production of missiles and drones going at the level it is. I think that's going to take some time to filter through. I wish they had done sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil years ago, and we would perhaps be in a different situation now.
Stephanie, it's always great to have you on the podcast. Thank you very much for your time today. I've just got a question about the issue I was talking about earlier on, which is, of course, countries like Kyrgyzstan and many other Central Asian countries who are buying an enormous amount of Western material that is being sold to them because they are not sanctioned countries, unlike Russia, and then selling them obviously onto Russia. And we believe that many of these, as I say, are drone components, parts for weapons, as well as just all sorts of other things that they can't otherwise access, including luxury goods. And I just wanted to talk or ask really a little bit more about where we are on that side of things. I know you were just saying that there are many different areas of sanctions that have been ineffective and that we haven't caught up with how the markets have adapted. But when you look at countries like Kyrgyzstan, I'm sure that there are many others that you could talk to. What more should be being done here? Why is it that $1 billion in a month can go from South Korea into Kyrgyzstan and then straight on into Russia? It just seems mad.
You're absolutely right. In the three and a half years after the full-scale invasion under the Biden administration, there was a concerted effort diplomatically to exert pressure on countries like Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, sort of Russia's near abroad, to crack down on that trade. You know, these are countries that are not following Western sanctions. They have historic, close economic ties with Russia. In many ways, they are very heavily dependent on Russia economically. So it's a very hard sell to get them to stop that trade. Unfortunately, the diplomatic efforts have not been very successful. Complaints that I heard while reporting my book, Punishing Putin, about the sanctions, that they were being lectured to and that their economies were so dependent, yet they were not given any carrots to follow Western sanctions. So I think the sanctions could have been more widely followed had EU, US, British efforts offered these countries some kind of economic alternative to follow those sanctions, so that the economic losses that they might have suffered, or the opportunities, for instance, that were presented to them to make money off of this trade into Russia, into Russia's defense industry, didn't look so attractive. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened. That has been one of the biggest loopholes in the sanctions regime, is third countries acting as a conduit for Russia's defense industry. It's the sort of Central Asian roundabout is what it's been called. You know, without offering them tangible benefits for following Western sanctions, it's going to be really hard to get them to follow. I mean, there's been other issues, including the production of nitrocellulose in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, which I know Western officials have been trying to shut down those deals selling nitrocellulose, which is a product of cotton, which is needed for armaments, trying to shut that trade down from Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan into Russia. But that requires a lot of diplomatic and economic tools, which are really not being deployed at this point. And of course, China and Hong Kong have been massive conduits for microelectronics going into Russia. But given the state of US-China relations, I think that's been a very hard issue to tackle.
And of course, we're talking about the third countries here, but many people listening would say, well, why can't you just ban businesses from selling to the third countries? That if it's known or highly suspected that these goods are going to then go on into Russia, why can't they just be stopped from doing so?
That's a really good question. I mean, in terms of the economic war, that has been seen by many policymakers as a step too far to put those sort of restrictions on domestic companies, to just take certain markets off the table who are offenders. The percentage of trade that is not related to Russia going into Kyrgyzstan, do you really want to put that kind of pressure on Kyrgyzstan? I agree with you. I think there could be a lot more done on that front. And I think the EU did try with certain countries and certain, the trade of cars, for instance, that were going through third countries into Russia. This has been a theme throughout policymakers did not want to impose too many requirements on companies to police their trade. But I think we're in a new world now where that's going to have to be the new reality. And that includes U.S. semiconductor giants. They need to get a handle on their global supply chain. And they can't just step back and say, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that my semiconductor chips were going into Russian missiles. That's not my fault. I don't believe that these major global companies with their huge revenues and their access to technology and AI cannot get a handle on their supply chains to crack down on this. But I don't so far see that there's an appetite within policy circles to require Western companies to look at the trade or even ban trade to third countries that happen to be violating Western sanctions on Russia. I just don't see it. The economic fallout from that, there would be an outcry. I think it does need to happen, and there can be perhaps new ideas about how to enforce that, how to make them see where their products are going, and perhaps fine companies who are shipping to third countries and not checking who, the end user is. I think that's one option, but we haven't seen that so far, unfortunately.
So final thoughts for the day. I will kick off pointing you, if you are able to, I recommend a talk by David Olusoga, the historian, the chap you see all over the telly. He's done A House Through Time, A Street Through Time. He's just been on Celebrity Traitors. He's got a new talk now called A Gun Through Time. It was his second night last night. It started in Bristol on Sunday. I went down to the Barbican last night, the concrete rabbit warren of hell that is the Barbican, fuelled only by 2 pints of Sussex Best and a packet of crisps, I'll have you know, from the Three Compasses. But that's another
what
story.
were the crisps? Crucial question. What were the crisps?
Salt and vinegar.
Yeah, that's all right.
So, David Olusoga's talk, do have a look, is on for another few days in Shrewsbury tonight, then Edinburgh later this month. A Gun Through Time takes 4 guns, the Brown Bess musket of Sharpie fame, a Lee Enfield .303, Thompson submachine gun, and a Maxim machine gun that was introduced in 1884, but is still in service today in Ukraine, a point he makes. It doesn't do the sort of military history of it. It doesn't go into muzzle velocity and calibers and all that kind of stuff. He talks about the social impact. Things like, for example, here in the UK, how phrases have resonated with these weapons, these terrible weapons that many people may never have touched, but have fed into our consciousness. So phrases like to go off half-cocked or flash in the pan all comes from the Brown Bess. So how this has affected our society today and how we relate to weaponry and the profession of arms and our relationship with the armed forces. It was a very, very interesting talk. He does speak very, very well. Like I say, that's on tonight, Shrewsbury and Edinburgh. Anyway, that's enough for me. I'm not on the payroll, by the way. I'm not plugging it. I'm just saying it was very interesting.
Thanks, Dom. An unexpected update now on my ongoing special interest, animals in war. We've mentioned before how Russian troops, short on reliable transport, have occasionally resorted to using donkeys behind the front lines. But last week brought a new addition to their improbable menagerie. Ukrainian troops claim to have rescued a camel used by Moscow's forces in eastern Ukraine. Yes, you heard that right, a camel. Specifically, a double-humped Bactrian, weighing about a ton and reportedly found wandering near Kyiv after Ukrainian troops overran a Russian position. The video shows it trotting behind a white pickup truck as soldiers work on a damaged M113 armoured personnel carrier. It honestly looks like something from Lawrence of Arabia. Camel experts for The Telegraph have identified it, as I say, as a Bactrian. That's a hardy Mongolian type bred to survive extreme temperatures of cold and heat and to carry heavy loads. So, in other words, a perfect conscript for the Russian army. The footage features in a Telegraph piece we've linked to in the show notes, along with photos of Russian soldiers actually using the camels behind the front lines. It also has video of horse-mounted assault teams from Russia's 9th Brigade in Donetsk. In some clips, 2 soldiers ride one horse, one steering, the other armed and preparing to fire their machine gun. It's all a bit mad, and they've got drones buzzing overhead. It looks like really it's more for propaganda, but just to quote one of the Kremlin-aligned bloggers commenting on it, horses see well at night, apparently better than, high advanced equipment, but anyway, don't need roads to accelerate on the final approach, and their instincts can help them avoid mines. I'm sure we will soon witness the historic return of the Russian cavalry to the ranks. Let's wish this modern horde luck. which feels rather like tempting fate and history in one go. Now, this may sound like something out of the 19th century, but it's not quite as anachronistic as it seems. The Second World War actually saw the largest use of horses in any conflict in history. The German Blitzkrieg was powered not just by tanks, but by around 3 million horses between 1939 and 1945. So, an interesting subject. And as I say, I really just want to thank anybody who has been sending in stories about animals in this war. I've had dozens of submissions already, and we'll be doing more on them soon, following the top 3 heroic mammals I posted about on X a few weeks ago. So do keep them coming.
Thanks, Francis. My old regiment, the Scots DG, used horses in Bosnia back in the late 90s. Stephanie, as our guest, would you like to leave us with any final thoughts?
Sure, thanks. I guess my final thought is, stepping back, Russia is now operating an almost fully sanctioned oil sector, much like Iran. Obviously the U.S., as I said, could go a lot further, sanctioning more of these tankers, but I think we're really in new territory now. And it's a bit like I said in my book, Punishing Putin, that this is a giant experiment in economic warfare, and we don't really know how it's going to play out. And there are a lot of different factors at play. Obviously, the Saudis pumping more oil is going to make this easier to kind of crowd Russia out of global oil markets and drive Russian oil revenues down. But we don't know how it's going to affect Russia and the economy. Russian economic data is pretty opaque. And traditionally, it's very hard to predict when the Russian economy is going to flail out as a result. I mean, I got my start as a reporter there in the 1990s and reported on the financial crisis of 1998. And I don't think I would have predicted when it would come. So I think we're really in uncharted territory, and there's a lot to go for here. I think it really depends how tough the Trump administration is there follow through? What's the rhetoric? And I think Trump's rhetoric on this is going to be really important. And as we know, his rhetoric has been all over the map. So does he stay on message or not? I think that's going to be crucial.
Thanks, Stephanie. Delighted to chat to you as always. Sorry, I don't mean to ambush you, but what's happening in Washington at the moment? What's doing the news rounds this morning? It's nearly 9 a.m. nearly.
Well, the thing I've just remarked on is it's so quiet here because of the government shutdown. I was up in the Senate building yesterday. It's very sleepy. A lot of people are working without pay. It's just a very bizarre, kind of almost surreal feeling here that the government has been shut down for, I think, what's the latest count, 33 days. We're, I think, 1 day off of it being the longest shutdown in U.S. history. So, I think that's the thing that is really hanging over this town is, can they get the government open? There are no talks. And, there's, I think, an expectation that this could drag on for quite a while, perhaps until everyone tries to fly home to see their family for Thanksgiving and there are flight delays because of air traffic controllers not getting paid. So it's a bizarre feeling to see the U.S. Capitol in all its glory, but the government's not functioning.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons, to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.